In this episode, I'll talk about Seacocks and thru-hull fittings, what they're for, where to put them, and the different types available. Now, you usually don't want seawater coming into your hull, but there's a few situations where you do. Engine cooling water, possibly for a salt water tap in the galley. And there are several situations where you want to let water or waste out, like cockpit drains, bilge pumps and sink drains. And once upon a time, but no longer, toilet waste. In all these situations, you need a thru-hull fitting attached to a seacock or valve so you can shut it off. Now, this is a standard fitting that's used around Sydney. I've used these a lot over many years. It's a standard bronze ball valve, and the thru-hull simply screws into the thread on the outside. You'd always use a thread sealant, of course. Then the nut clamps down over the thickness of your hull and a backing pad. You always use a backing pad, and I'll go into that a bit later on. So that these don't stand up too high, it's generally best to cut this so that there's not a great deal of distance between the nut when it's tightened and the ball valve. Just need enough to be able to work on it, get the spanner to it. Of course, they always have a hose tail to attach your hose, and again, that just simply screws in on Loctite or one of those type of thread sealants. They're a ball valve. They simply close off that way, a simple action of closing off, and you always know it's closed because the lever is at right angles to the travel of the water. When it's turned that way, the lever is in line with the travel of the water, so it's easy to see at a glance whether it's off or on. Well, the main advantage of the bronze ball valve is that it's relatively cheap. The main disadvantage is that it's less secure than some other types that I'll show you in a sec. The clamping action of this nut on the pad and the thickness of your hull is all that's supporting it. So you need, well, one thing, you need a large block to spread any load, large backing block, but you also want to be careful about sighting them anywhere where large objects, boat gear or feet or anything else are going to hit it, because it's a long lever arm that can strain this area. A better choice, but way more expensive, this kind of seacock, an actual seacock rather than a ball valve. This one made by Spartan Marine in the USA. They have not a ball but a cylinder that rotates to close off. They have an outside fitting of a very similar nature that simply threads in. I'm using this one as my water intake, 3/4 inch diameter, and I'm using a strainer on the outside. It's an integral strainer. You can buy these, but you can also buy some that have a built-in strainer, but I find that being able to take these apart annually to clean the muck out, the little creatures and weed and everything loves to grow in under here and restrict your water flow. So it's better that you can annually take these off and clean them out and replace them. Anti-foul, put a bit of anti-fouling paint even on the inside when you replace them. One of the big advantages of this kind of more expensive seacock is that they're actually through-bolted right through the hull and your backing pad. And on this kind, the bolts actually are outside the flange of the thru-hull, and they provide a much more stable and secure seacock firmly on the hull. The other advantage is that you can easily dismantle them for servicing. Annual servicing, when you're out of the water, you can simply undo that and clean it out and grease it, make sure it's working well for the following season. When you're servicing a traditional ball valve, you only have the clamping action of the nut on the pad and the hull surface to resist the turning motion as you undo this, and there will be it will be tight to undo if you've used a thread compound to to make sure it's sealed from the water, which you must do. So it's very hard not to disturb the sealant on this, and if you've moved that and disturbed the sealant, it will leak at some stage. So it's best when you're servicing these to actually take them completely out of the hull, clean up all the bedding compound, and start again once you've finished. There's another kind of Seacock made in England by Blakes and Taylors. It works on a different principle. Instead of the rotating cylinder as in the Spartan ones, or the rotating ball as in the ball valves, they have some sort of tapered plug that winds in and out. They can also be dismantled easily for servicing, and they have a big advantage that their flange on the outside of the through hull actually bolts clean through the inside flange of the Seacock, and I think they have 3 bolts, so it's even more stable, strong and secure. I've not used them myself, but I gather they're fairly standard in England, and everybody there would recommend them, I'm sure. Engine cooling water intakes should be close to the water pump on the engine and usually routed through a filter. Sink drains obviously should be under the sink. Cockpit drains' connection hoses to their Seacocks should be crossed over so that the cockpit will drain when heeled. Bilge pumps can empty on the top sides or transom or even the cockpit, and some folks leave out the Seacocks in these locations. Ease of access is something you must consider. Drill your hole in the middle of the plank and between cranes. Either drill a pilot hole or just drill far enough for the centre bit of the hole saw to go through, then drill back from the outside. Hole saws have a tendency to splinter out as they break through if you do it in one go. Check that the through hull is a slide-in fit. A tight fit on a new boat may lead to splitting of the plank when the wood swells and contracts. Every through hull needs a backing pad. These need to cover the whole plank you're drilling through, plus overlap onto both adjacent planks. If they fit up against a rib, you need to allow for drainage underneath so water doesn't get trapped above them. In the case of my water intake, the pad filled the space between the ribs and the bolts were close enough to the edge to prohibit bevelling off for drains under the pad. So I sloped the top of the pad so no water would gather. The pads must fit snug against the hull, so they usually have to be shaped to fit. I use blue chalk to highlight the high spots with multiple goes until the fit is snug. Then drill through the pad and the hull if you're using bolted Seacocks. Always do a dry fit to make sure it all works. This is easier with 2 people, but you can do it alone. You need to make sure the outside fitting fits square with its landing on the hull. If not, you may have to modify the backing block. Then prime all the bare wood on the pads and on the hull. I also paint grey bilge paint on the pads where they'll be visible. Push the bolts through the hull planking from outside. I'm a belt and braces man, so I put a grommet of caulking cotton under the head of the bolt as well as sealant around the shaft. Then put loads of sealant under the pad on both mating surfaces and fit it in place. Again, I did it alone, but it's easier with 2 people. Then more sealant where the Seacock will land, as well as plenty under the Seacock itself, making sure you fill the groove that's machined into the base for that purpose. Tighten the nuts, but not too much just yet. Screw in the through-hull fitting with lots of sealant. I'm using the same polyurethane as the thread sealant as well. Tighten it up using an old file or a rusty chisel that can engage the lugs inside the opening. Then fully tighten the nuts inside. Here's where the mechanics cringe. It's a mechanic's joke that a shipwright's mechanical toolkit is a hammer and a shifting spanner. Then go out and retighten the through hull. I filled these bolt head counterboards with sealant as well. I would have liked to use epoxy filler, but so much sealant had found its way into the holes that it would have been difficult to clean it out enough to make epoxy stick. With larger fittings like my cockpit drain Seacocks, fitting is in several stages. It's just the same process until you fit the through hull. Because in this case the bolt heads are under the outside flange. In a boatyard situation you could certainly just cover the bolt heads with the sealant, as I did on the smaller through hull. But having plenty of time, I decided to fill the bolt head counterboards with epoxy filler. So after a semi-dry fitting of the through hull, I withdrew it, filled the holes, then cleaned it up the next day. I dry fitted it again to make sure it all worked, then primed the bare epoxy, and a day or so later fitted the through hull for good. I'm not quite ready to fit the ball valves for the bilge pump outlets in the transom, but I'll show that in a later episode. Thanks for watching.